Hi, this is Reverend Dr. Nadine Rosechild Sullivan, and I'm recording this on Saturday, but I'm recording it to upload on Sunday, May 9th, 2021. And so let me wish you happy Mother's Day. I want to just take a moment and talk about the history of this holiday. We don't know the history of this holiday, right? We grow up maybe going to a congregation of worship where we are given one color of carnation if our mother's alive and another if she's deceased. And, we all go out to dinner and we give, maybe we give our mother a potted plant or, we do something, maybe we make her breakfast in bed or we expect to collect that when we are my age, and so as I expect to collect some of that tomorrow. But in that space, this is not where Mother's Day began, right? We all, and for just a moment also, let me note that we all have very complicated relationships with the women who give birth to us and with the children to whom we give birth. And so whatever that looks like for you and however you're gendered in that, setting, I teach in a class called Sexuality and Society. I often talk about times and places in the globe when there was a recognition, a more reverential recognition of mother as life giver, as of the great womb of the universe, of this concept that all of this recognition that all life comes through women, right? Every human that's ever been born has been born through a woman, whether that, however that baby was gendered, that every one of us has come through a woman, whether she raised us or not, whether we were raised by her or by an adoptive mother or foster mother or an aunt or a grandmother or, whatever that was, even feral children who were, living in a doghouse. And I different class, some movies on the damage done to the brain if we're not properly socialized as children by human interaction. But in that space, every one of us came in through someone who carried us as close to term as we made it. And by some method, we were brought through a uterus, brought through a womb. But even in the recognition of that, this is not where Mother's Day began, right? So the celebration that we have of Mother's Day actually begins, it starts as an anti-war peace activist moment and movement. So it begins our earliest crediting it as we celebrated here, at least here in the United States and around a lot of the globe today. It begins in 1870. And there is a document written by a woman by the name of Julia Ward Howe, Howe. And Julia Ward Howe is an American abolitionist. She was fighting for the end of slavery, one of thousands and thousands and thousands of people fighting for the end of slavery, but actively involved in the cause of abolition, wanting the end of slavery and the end of the enslavement of African Americans. She also worked for women's rights. So early on, she became a suffragist, actively working for women to gain the vote. She was a social justice activist, both in grounds of race and gender. And she was also a peace activist, especially as her life progressed, and a poet. So she is the author of the lyrics of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And so we all know at least some of her poetry. During the Civil War, Julia Ward Howe, as many women, contributed to that war effort by helping to nurse wounded soldiers. And so she was working with, in that setting, working with, so actually a lot of the history of nursing attaches to that particular war. There's more to it than that, but to women contributing in that kind of way. And Julia Ward Howe is one of the women who was working with the wounded during the Civil War. And after the war, she continues her work by working with the orphans and the widows of the soldiers. And she begins to really note the complexity of the damages done to family networks and to societies beyond simply what's done to the body of the soldier, in this case himself, right? And so there is the cost of the horror of war on the battlefield, the cost to mental health and emotional health. We know we've started to recognize that war creates PTSD in those who face engagement and conflict, and And so, there was that that she wouldn't have been using that terminology, but noting those kinds of effects on the soldier. We also know, of course, that if a soldier's body is wounded, that there can be lifelong repercussions of that, or one's life is lost. Clearly, that is an ending of life, right? But also that the effects it had on their children, their wives, their mothers, their grandmothers, their aunts, their uncles, their fathers, their brothers, their cousins, their nieces and nephews, the whole realm of our social connections, of the networks of people who are our family and friends, and the effects of that. And she began increasingly to oppose war. She also, as a suffragist and a women's rights activist, believed in the agency of women. She believed in our power as full human beings to contribute to the public sphere. She also believed in our agency to have an effect on the political sphere. And so she called for women to come together across all groups, women of all races, and across all national boundaries. Internationally, she called for women to gather together to resist war, or the use of war as an answer to conflict. And so she issued a Mother's Day proclamation. Well, we call it that now, but it was actually, she titled it An Appeal to Womanhood Throughout the World. So Julia Ward Howe's Mother's Day proclamation in 1870, I'm going to read it now. An appeal to womanhood throughout the world. She writes, again, in the sight of the world have the skill and power of two great nations exhausted themselves in mutual murder. She was referring to a new conflict after the Civil War. Again, have the sacred questions of international justice been committed to the fatal mediation of military weapons. In this day of progress, in this century of light, the ambition of rulers has been allowed to barter the dear interest of the domestic life for the bloody exchanges of the battlefield. Thus men have done, thus men will do, but women need no longer be made party to proceedings which fill the globe with grief and horror. Despite the assumptions of physical force, the mother has a sacred and commanding word to say to the sons who owe their lives to her suffering. That word should now be heard and answered to as never before. Arise then, women of this day. Arise, all women who have hearts. Whether your baptism be that of water or of tears, say firmly, we will not have great questions decided by irrelevant agencies. Our husbands shall not come to us, reeking with carnage for caresses and applause. Our sons shall not be taken from us to unlearn all that we have been able to teach them of charity, mercy, and patience. We, women of one country, will be too tender of those of another country to allow our sons to be trained to injure theirs. From the bosom of the devastated earth, a voice goes up with our own. It says, disarm, disarm. The sword of murder is not the balance of justice. Blood does not wipe out dishonor, nor violence vindicate possession. As men have often forsaken the plow and the anvil at the summons of war, let women now leave all that may be left of home for a great and earnest day of council. Let them meet first as women to bewail and commemorate the dead. Let them then solemnly take counsel with each other as to the means whereby the great human family can live in peace, man as the brother of man, each bearing after his own kind the sacred impress not of Caesar, but of God. In the name of womanhood and of humanity, I earnestly ask that a general council of women without limit of nationality may be appointed and held at some place deemed most convenient and at the earliest period consistent with its objects to promote the alliance of the different nationalities, the amicable settlement of international questions, the great and general interests of peace. Mother's Day did not become a national holiday at that time. It became a national holiday in 1907 after another peace activist, a woman by the name of Anna Jarvis, who also cared for wounded soldiers during the Civil War and who also did work after the Civil War by founding what she called Mother's Day work clubs to address public health issues after she began to promote a Mother's Day both of these women intended Mother's Day to be a call to women to come together to fight against war, to resist the use of war as a means to answer conflicts. That's not how our world looks today. As we sit here tonight, as you go to dinner or make dinner or do whatever you're doing in these fraught times of pandemic, however you are addressing your celebration or modification thereof tomorrow or today as I'm releasing it. It was not about my children honoring me for all the sacrifices I did, including pregnancy and childbirth. But as she said, these men came into the world through our suffering, through our literal physical suffering, right? That's that. But that's not, Mother's Day is not about me being honored because I happened to, or chose, whichever it was, to get pregnant and to and succeeded at carrying to term and giving birth. It's not about that. It's not about honoring my mother, who did that a whole lot of times. Not about that. It's about women coming together and saying, we bring life into this world. We intend those we bring into this world, any of us with, some level of compassion. And as I said, women, range on the scale of kinds of human beings. But those of us who have compassion and concern and are, relatively grounded in this reality and who love our babies and who do our best to, for all of our humanity, to bring them up and to raise them with some sort of moral compass or ethical guidelines, and who do our best to be moral and ethical with them and to turn out quality human beings who will grow up and, and make some sort of contribution, carry their own weight in life, find something they love to do and pursue it, feed themselves and give something back to the world. We don't have our children, by and large, with the intent of them going off in conflict with others or dying in those kinds of places. And so women after the Civil War, some women after World War I, World War II had fewer anti-war or peace movement activists. Certainly, however, as we came up, I was old enough to have been on the outskirts of the protest against the war in Vietnam and the demand to end that war and to bring the men home and to honor their soldiers. We were not, those of us who were against the war were not against our soldiers. We were against, there was no reason for this conflict. This conflict was being fought, as many conflicts are fought for. I forget the name of and I didn't know it would come to me, but Matthew McConaughey plays a character in a Civil War setting, and he's inducted into the Confederate Army. And I forget if it has something to do with the state, which state. I'm thinking it's Mississippi, but I could be wrong. But anyway, it ends up being a county named after the man. He's playing a real man. But he's playing a person who at some point as a Confederate soldier comes to the recognition that he himself, who is he fighting for? What is he fighting about? And the realization in this movie that he is, or of this character in real life, that he's fighting for the rich men to keep ownership of their slaves, when he himself is one of the multitudes of white poor in the South who didn't benefit from slavery. And he actually ends up out in the woods and with other soldiers that he caused, they all kind of come to this recognition that they're not actually fighting for their own interests. They're not defending their own land. They're not defending a system that's a benefit to them. They're fighting for someone else. And this was kind of the recognition that we were having as a generation, as our brothers and our boyfriends were going off to fight in Vietnam. I am old enough to have spent my high school years with a girlfriend whose boyfriend was in Vietnam, and he and she were sending some sort of audio recordings back and forth to each other, and it's long enough ago, they must have been some sort of reel-to-reel thing. They weren't cassette tapes, but they were sending letters back and forth and sending recordings back and forth, and she was, I was watching her mourn for him and watching her never know if he would return home safely. And he did. She was fortunate, and he returned home safely and intact, and they did go on and marry and have a life together. But other friends of mine, were going off. One of the boy who walked me to kindergarten, me and my brother to kindergarten, because he was a little older than us, when I saw him after his return from Vietnam, he was not the same as he had been before. And, another friend of mine, she and her brother she was high school girls. We called each other first best friends and second best friends. She was at that time my second best friend in high school, and she and her brother were killed in a car accident, along with another girl that I didn't know. But it was just weeks before he was being shipped off to Vietnam. And in the midst of our mourning for her, there was a recognition swept through our friendship group that he had died without going to war, and would he have died if he had gone to Vietnam? And what was, there was just something so final about being in the summer between my sophomore and junior years of high school, and recognizing that death could come so definitively to someone my age and to her brother, who was just 2 or 3 years older, and but also that it was coming all around us, and it was coming to our friends, and it was and we didn't know what that war wasn't for us, like that Matthew McConaughey movie. It wasn't for us. And if I look it up, I'll put it in the description underneath the video, but it was the title of that movie. It was for some rich men somewhere who wanted something that had something that didn't, it did in the domino theory, wasn't doing it anymore for us. And so we had lots and lots and lots of demonstrations and peace activists and anti-war folk music that were, and singers that, Joan Baez and Bob Dylan and just others that still are, Guthrie, and a generation that was touched by that peace activism. And then that sort of ended, and we rolled over into the decade since. We rolled over into other eras, and we rolled over into, the Reagan times and the times of it. And then there's this, this moment in time when the World Trade Towers and the Pentagon building are attacked by planes from the sky. And somehow the line gets drawn saying that it had something to do with Iraq and Afghanistan. And there was no connect the dots between what actually happened and the countries, the nation states that we went to war with, but there was no saying anything about that circa 2001 or 2 or 3 or 4, because it just felt so anti-patriotic. We had been attacked on our own soil. And so it's been a difficult road for those who have fought for peace, but we have a long history of peace activism in the United States. We have Frances Perkins Gilman, I think, or Frances Perkins, maybe just, anyway, there was a woman, it might have been Jeannette Rankin. Anyway, there was a woman who she was the first US woman in the House of Representatives, that I've got right. And she voted against the war. I think she voted against World War I and World War II. And, not very popular opinions to take to oppose some wars. And, there were some Quakers standing for peace at the top of the street I live on, much of the early days of the war in Iraq, or the war against Iraq, whatever. And so in this moment, as we sit here tonight on this Mother's Day, let me just bring back to our consciousness the thoughts of Julia Ward Howe and the thoughts of Anna Jarvis and other women and other men who have said, war is not the way to go. I will also mention here a song by Buffy St. Marie, also one of those folk singer activists and Indigenous woman, First Nations from Canada, who is still out there singing. But she did a song called Universal Soldier. She also did some fabulous work for the American Indian movement and Indigenous rights. But you can YouTube Universal Soldier, Buffy St. Marie. Put in the word lyrics into your YouTube search and it will come up. And she makes the point in that song that the orders to war come from far away no more. They don't come from Caesar anymore, because this is supposed to be a democracy. And in a democracy, then orders are supposed to come from you and me, right? And so as we move forward in this world, it's a very dangerous world to be at war in. And I understand that there's also a documentary called Why We Fight. And so to put this point out there too, which is this kind of counterbalance, Dwight Eisenhower, as he was making his goodbye speech, as he was leaving the White House and saying, making his last address to the nation, probably in the Oval Office at the Resolute desk. But as Dwight Eisenhower is sitting there and he is saying goodbye to the nation, he talks about why, because of the invention of atomic weapons at that point, because of the invention of weaponry that could wipe out the human race, he makes the point that there will never be a time when we are not at war going forward. The United States had not been in perpetual war prior to World War II. And so he's making the point, and he talks about the military, industrial, academic complex that will be sold out to the manufacture of weapons and larger, more and more devastating weapons, and to the continual manufacture of weaponry and the continual need, not just of a standing army, but the continual need of being, the big dog that keeps the other guy down. He was much more eloquent than I'm being at the moment, but I recommend you, Google and watch the first few minutes of the documentary Why We Fight. And it opens with Dwight Eisenhower's speech. And after viewing that and thinking about it, it's really quite clear that every president from Eisenhower or from World War II on has indeed done war somewhere. And so I bring up again, I channel the spirits of suffragist and peace activist and abolitionist Julia Ward Howe and of Anna Jarvis in the call for a way for the human race to move forward to peace. My intention is not for those children I love and help raise to grow up and lose life or limb or sanity in war. Neither is it my intention or desire that this be any part of your lived experience either. So Mother's Day is actually an anti-war peace activist day. And these women called for us to rise to that challenge. We'll also mention briefly that the Director General of the World Health Organization, whose name I could pretend to butcher but won't, made the statement this week that more cases of COVID-19 have been reported globally in the past 2 weeks than during the first 6 months of the pandemic. And that the world has now reached 3,200,000 and almost 295,000 deaths. The United States has come to the place of having 33,448,865 diagnosed cases. And according to ncov2019.live on May 8th, 2019, sometime about 3 hours ago, so sometime around 4 p.m., the statistic for deaths in the United States at that time had reached 595,463. With an increase this week, that's an increase of 5,300 more deaths in the United States, or about 759 per day this week. And I will also point out that I'm quoting now, Amy Goodman reported this on Democracy Now! On March 7th, 2021 at minute 9 of the headline broadcast. She says, a new study from the University of Washington estimates the true toll of the pandemic is far higher than governments have reported. Researchers at the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation say COVID-19 has caused about 6.9 million deaths worldwide. So the stats I had from ENCO 2019, which are just a touch higher than the CDC's, those stats were globally 150, no, globally 300, sorry, these commas that come between long numbers, 3,295,000. So she's saying that the University of Washington estimates them at 6.9 million. So not 3.3 million, but 6.9 million, more than double the official figure. Topping the list, she reports, is the United States with over 900,000 estimated deaths. So we're actually estimating it close to 600,000. This research report says that we're actually at about 900,000, followed by India with more than 650,000 deaths. The researchers projected about 600,000 deaths each in Mexico and Brazil and Russia. And so, okay. So that's the report, is that there are about twice as many deaths as are being reported by governments. Partly that's intentional, maybe, and partly not. Some of these leaders in places like Brazil particularly, and Modi in India encouraging large unmasked gatherings, and some of what's happened here, a lot of the government officials have been cavalier about public health measures to limit the spread. And so there is some level of underreporting that one can expect in those settings. On the other hand, early on in the pandemic, there were no tests, or no tests in the United States. There was a WHO test we were rejecting, but there was a lack of testing early, and then a lack of access to testing for quite long into the whole first part of the first wave. So living in Pennsylvania and having students in New Jersey and having students with family in North Jersey and New York, and so the whole Philadelphia to New York metro area, this whole region saw that first wave. And in seeing that, in that whole time, beginning for us and in mid-March, as far as we knew, and then of 2020, and sweeping through March and April and May and June and July, there was no access to testing. If you had symptoms, if you thought your symptoms were COVID, you couldn't do much about it. You got to kind of stay home until you couldn't breathe, and then go to the hospital, and maybe you were lucky and got a room, and maybe you got sent home. Maybe you got an oxygen tank, which is something they would really like to have in India right now, right? So that whole space, India is just, our height of our deaths were running around 4,000 a day. They are running around 4,000 a day. They're running over 400,000 new diagnosed cases per day. But so there's been, in all of our statistic keeping, there's been some measure of dissimulation, and there's been a measure of just, we simply didn't have tests, or you couldn't get the test out there, the people died before the test, or the people were rural or whatever. So, or wherever around the globe, so many places without the testing, or even now, or the means of dealing with any kind of ways of dealing with this as a health crisis. So tonight, it's better for me. I don't know how it is for you, but for me, there's a sense of relief that has grown continuously since my second vaccination, and which was the middle of March. And so coming up on 2 months after my second dose, and the knowledge, the science is good. The science is that the vaccines are safe and effective. The science is that, that I'm 95% immunized against any possibility of getting it, and 99%, point something against the possibility of dying from it. That is fabulous. The science appears to indicate that it's a UK variant all over my region now. The science indicates that, I should also be safe from the UK variant, and probably the Brazilian variant, and questions as new variants arise about what the vaccines will, how effective, will there be a reduction in effectiveness against some variant? There were certainly ways in which the 1918 flu pandemic, which really was the 1918 through 1920 pandemic, evolved and morphed and changed, and variants arose, and the different variants did different things in different waves then as well. So, not going to be foolish, still masked, and, still Not doing a whole lot of being out in public places, but certainly if I do have to be somewhere public, I'm going to be masked and have my Purell in my pocket. That said, I just feel like life is beginning to get back to normal. It's spring again, and solidly spring working its way toward summer. And it is beautiful, and we're past Beltane, and it's just really, life is feeling pretty good right now. I'm feeling hope again. I'm feeling a lifting again. Yet at the same time, my heart breaks for people watching what's happening in India, watching what's happening in other places, and also knowing that about half of our nation hasn't even gotten one dose, knowing that our children need the vaccine and need to be vaccinated, both for their sakes and ours, knowing that the cases that are in the hospital now, that our hospitalizations are rising, our deaths are not shooting up. We still have people dying, but they're not shooting up because most of the people getting sick now are younger, because most of the older people have been quicker to be vaccinated. First off, it opened to us sooner. We were allowed to get vaccinated sooner, and we've not been as vaccine resistant maybe as some, or hesitant as some. But in this moment, wherever you're at, I encourage you to continue to do everything possible to keep you and yours safe in the natural. We should always do that which is in our hand to do. We should use the agency that Julia Ward Howe saw that we have. And as we move forward, we should continue to remember our history. We should remember those who have gone before us, the brave men and the brave women who have gone before us in American history and in global history to fight for others, for health, for life, for the very core of life, right? Birth. Not and I am pro, I believe in a woman's right to choose. I believe as someone whose mother had no access to birth control and who has written a book on contraception, I believe in that. But in the place where it's wise and right and good to give birth, and where we have the resources to raise a child in love and with intentionality, and that has been one of the great joys of my life. I actually was not fond at all. I know other women feel differently about it, but I was not fond at all of pregnancy. And childbirth was much more than I expected, or was led to believe. But I treasure my children and my experience of being able to raise them. And I am grateful to all that is, that I was able to raise them in a location where no bombs were falling on our heads, and where we had access to food, and where the earth had not warmed to a place where there was no access to food. I was grateful to raise them in a time and a place where I and they had peace and health and safety. And I've been grateful every day for the experience of being part of my grandchildren's lives. And there's joy in that part, and the renewal of life and the cycle of life and the energy that comes back with spring and the turning of the world. And so in this space, I encourage you to take this moment and to count whatever blessings you've got, whatever you've got in regard to health or peace or safety or shelter or food, whatever it is you have, and whatever it is of those things that you don't have. My heart breaks for you, because we're all connected. And so in this moment, let's just take a moment to send some peace and some energy and our best intentions. I'm not empowered. I can't take vaccines to India. I don't have them. I can't manufacture them. Can't give the patents. I can't do any of those things that Biden has said he'll share the patents, or whatever role he actually plays in that, given, whatever our weird connections of private pharmaceuticals and governmental agencies. But let's just take a moment and send what we have energetically. I do also believe in the power of prayer, and I believe in the power of human intention and human energy. And so right now with me, I envision you and yours and me and mine safe and well throughout this whole time. I envision the time when this thing ends and you and yours and me and mine are still standing, whole and safe and well, partly through our own agency and partly through the blessings that have been given to us to allow us the first world privilege of being in that place, the access that we've had to whatever kind of help we've needed or been able to access in this space. But you and I also take this moment to envision the divine light of Source and our intention of goodness for all those who are suffering all around the world, both from the ravages of this pandemic and the ravages of racism and the ravages of poverty, and from bombs that rain down from the sky in acts of war. All those human beings who think and feel, even as we think and feel, whose shoes we are fortunate enough not to stand in tonight. We send love and peace and energy to them. And in any measure where we can raise our voice for justice, in any measure in which we can raise our voices for peace, for humankind to treat each other right, we do that now. Taking this moment to realize that so much of the pain in the earth is human caused and need not be. We take this moment to envision leaders who are not corrupt, who care for the best interests of the people, who fight for their true constituencies, for the diversity of their constituencies, who stand up for the rights of all of their constituents to vote, to have access to voting, to have access to medical care, even if they're transgender, maybe especially if they're transgender. We stand for the right of all to learn the truth of history because there are actual facts. We stand for an end to governmental uses of conflict, of war as a way to solve or resolve conflict. We ask for supernatural help in keeping the globe safe from nuclear war and recognize that as foolish as humans can be, there must be and have been supernatural help these many decades since we've had that power to destroy ourselves. And we take a moment as well to pray now for our globe and for every species that is threatened by the ways we're affecting this climate, including humankind. And with whatever you believe in, or whatever means you pray, I connect my faith with yours for the safe deliverance of this planet and of the human species from war, from what we're doing to the environment, and from one of the effects of that environmental change, this pandemic. For just this moment, see every human being having access to proper hygiene and PPE, peaceful, safe housing, the food they need, and absolutely to the medical care they need, and to every vaccine that will keep them safe. Take the time to enjoy whatever family or friends you've got, virtually or in person, this Mother's Day. In the recognition, it didn't start as a day to honor a little nuclear family unit or the matriarch of a clan. It started as a day to call women to stand together and to meet in council, to stand and force governments to demand that their governments here and that across national borders to demand that women demand that governments stop using war as a way to end disagreements. May we, as Americans, those of us who are, and I don't think I've got an international audience at this point. I don't know that I've got one very broad at all, but as Americans, we need to, we really, really need to let the racial issues of the Civil War be decided. This Civil War needs to be over and decided in favor of racial justice, in favor of all of us loving each other as human beings, because we are the same. We have cultural variations and ways of expressing ourselves. We have delightful ways in which our diversities can add to each other. But every one of us thinks and feels and bleeds. Every one of us was born of a mother, came through the door of a womb. Happy Mother's Day.